Welcome everyone. Good to see you. Thanks for coming to our second legal philosophy seminar of the term. Very pleased to have with us Professor Arash Abizadeh from McGill University. Professor Abizadeh is an associate professor in the Department of Political Science at McGill, but also an affiliated member of the Department of Philosophy there. He's got graduate degrees, an MPhil from Oxford University, and a doctorate from Harvard in the Department of Government. Or I also learned that he won a dissertation prize for the best dissertation in political philosophy, which is a nice honor for your PhD. His research interests, so as a political theorist, his research focuses on questions of democratic theory, history of political philosophy, contemporary political theory, nationalism, and discourse ethics. He's published several articles on each of these, in each of these areas, as well as others, including cosmopolitanism, immigration, identity, political legitimacy, and today's topic, borders. I also learned he's currently working on 2 book manuscripts on Hobbes, one on insight and the will, and the other on Hobbes's view of normativity. So we're very pleased to have Professor Abizadeh with us today. He's going to present a paper on the special obligations challenge to open borders. So as usual, we'll have Professor Abizadeh give about a 35 to 40-minute presentation and leave plenty of time for questions and discussion with the audience. So welcome.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me. I'm very pleased to be here. Thank you for coming. One of the most powerful arguments for more open borders, and I'm talking about political borders, the borders of the state, appeals to a notion of justice. It's widely believed that justice requires treating all persons as equals. This doesn't necessarily mean that one needs to show equal concern for all persons. Justice understood in this sense of treating people as equals is compatible with special obligations that one might have to one's near and dear. But it does require treating others with equal respect. And so the question is, what is required to treat other persons as equals when you're exercising political power over them? That's sort of the starting motivation behind this presentation, and that will set up the problem that I want to deal with. So what's required when you treat all persons as equals? When you exercise political power, which obviously also includes coercive political power over them. I want to start out with the assumption that it requires respecting 2 negative constraints. First is, if you're exercising political power over persons, don't use it to systematically prevent them from pursuing opportunities to meet their very basic needs. So that's one way in which you ensure that you're treating them as equals, is by not violating that constraint. And the second is, don't use it to entrench structurally significant sources of material inequality amongst persons. So you can think of this as these 2 constraints of justice, understood as treating persons as equals, or at least including that, and it implying these 2 constraints for the exercise of political power over persons. And you can see how this can have this can produce a kind of a justice argument for more open borders, because migration between states is one of the most promising ways that people from impoverished countries have to escape from that poverty and to meet very basic needs. It's also one of the most promising ways that they have to improve their relative material standing. So there's empirical research on this that shows how promising that is for individuals. And so it appears, if you accept this conception of treatment of persons as equals and the constraints that it plays on exercising state political power over individuals, that it gives you a pro tanto moral duty, in our world at least, for more open borders. This is a world that's characterized by tremendous levels of poverty and material inequality at the global level. at least more open borders on the part of wealthy developed states with respect to migrants from poorer states. Right, so, and of course this, if you think about the first constraint that I mentioned, it's very relevant for sort of contemporary issues that are in the media now because of the tremendous salience of the issue of forced migration, asylum seekers who are pursuing very basic human needs, security, for example, escape from war zones. So if this is a kind of a pro tanto argument, what I'm interested here in this presentation and the paper that it's based on is a reply to the justice argument for more open borders that appeals and tries to refute it, that takes its premises for granted. So there's a kind of a common commitment here to a notion of justice, but nevertheless the argument here, and this is what I'm calling the special obligations challenge to more open borders, on this view, the pro tanto duty is overcome. Even though, right, so it's not a rejection of this conception of justice, but it is accepts its basic terms, but nevertheless says there's an argument here that appeals to special obligations that's capable of overcoming this pro tanto duty. How does it work? Well, first of all, the argument is that there are special obligations amongst compatriots to protect the most disadvantaged members of their political community, their most disadvantaged compatriots. In other words, that we have a duty to show our compatriots who are particularly disadvantaged in our political community a special concern. And in fact, right, it's a concern that we need to show for their welfare that is greater than any concern that we might have for the global poor who, or otherwise needy, who in fact might be more needy than our compatriots. And so that's a kind of a normative premise about the existence of these compatriotic special obligations. And the second point is that if migration of certain kinds of people harms this domestic poor to whom we owe these special obligations, then we have an obligation to close borders, even if the migrants to whom we are closing them are worse off than the domestic poor to whom we owe these special obligations. So that's if you see the normative kind of argument in the normative premises of the special obligations challenge to more open borders. And then the argument here is that you appeal to an empirical premise that, for example, migration by low-skilled workers from abroad, as a matter of empirical fact, it might be claimed harms the domestic poor, and one mechanism might do so, by which it might do so, is by depressing wages at the low end of the pay scale in the domestic economy. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to take for granted the empirical premise, though I have a lot of doubts about it. In fact, some co-authors and I have tried to, we've published on this and tried to show that as a matter of empirical fact, low-skilled migration by and large has little to no impact on wages of low-skilled workers in wealthy countries, North America and in Europe, except for on the wages of previous cohorts of migrants. There's an argument for why this is the case, so that's an interesting empirical fact. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to take for granted the empirical premise. I'm going to take for granted that there are special obligations that we may have that are compatible with the requirements of justice. And I want to argue that even if it is true that low-skilled migration from impoverished regions of the world to wealthy polities would harm the domestic poor, relatively speaking, I want to argue that nevertheless the special obligations challenge does not succeed to the justice, overcoming the justice argument for more open borders. And in particular, I want to challenge the normative premise that special obligations that we have to our fellow compatriots somehow overcomes this pro tanto duty that we have in the use of coercive exercise of political power over non-citizens. And I'm going to do this by asking what the grounds would be for compatriotic special obligations. On the assumption that there is such special obligations, the question is, where do they come from? What kinds of relationships would one think would ground these? And I think in the literature we can find three different kinds of arguments for why we have special obligations to our fellow citizens. The first emphasizes, the first kind of set of arguments, they emphasize social relationships. The second emphasize civic features of citizenship, the institution of citizenship itself. And the third emphasizes a kind of political relationship of joint responsibility for the exercise of political power. So social, civic, and political. And I'll take these in order. So one set of arguments that appeals to social relationships, a good example of this is the idea that, well, look, people who share a political society, they participate in a territorially bounded, mutually beneficial scheme of social cooperation, which grounds special duties of reciprocity to each other, and that in turn is grounded in some kind of principle of fair play. So those of you that are familiar with kind of Rawlsian arguments about fair play within the context of a scheme of social cooperation should see what the motivation behind that is. Now, one thing that you should notice about this is that actually, if it's the case that participation in a scheme of mutual cooperation, mutually beneficial social cooperation grounds special obligations amongst the participants, that those participants don't actually coincide with citizens, rather they coincide with the residents. If you think about it as territorially bound, why? Because residents, even if they're not citizens, nevertheless, can contribute to the economy, they can work and so on. Normally in most of the states that we're talking about, this is quite possible. So we kind of have to expand the notion of compatriot here to include long-term residents at the very least. And I want to say that it's true, I think, that if we conceive of a political society in these terms as a scheme of social cooperation, that this would ground special obligations to compatriots understood in this extended sense. But we need to distinguish between two different kinds of special obligations. Special obligations that add to our pre-existing duties to sacrifice our own self-interest for the sake of others, for example, that add to that. Think of these as additional concern that we have to show to those with whom we are engaged in a schemes of social cooperation, as opposed to special obligations that we have that justify prioritizing some people over others. In other words, sacrificing the interest of others in order to be able to prioritize those to whom we have special obligations. And what I want to argue here is that the fact that we engage in a mutually beneficial scheme of social cooperation with associates does not free us from the general duties that we have to the non-participants. What it does is it adds to the obligations that we have, pre-existing general duties that we have. It adds to that by giving us these special obligations to those who participate. But it doesn't allow us, it doesn't give us a moral liberty, if you like, to discharge our special responsibilities to our co-participants by shirking our general duties to non-participants. And so it kind of gives you additional concerns, but it doesn't give you a prioritizing to the detriment of those general duties that you have to others. Now, a different kind of argument that also emphasizes social relationships would be a kind of equal stakes view. The idea here is that, well, you have special obligations to those people who have a roughly equal stake in the political society's well-being, and so that, again, you think citizens and perhaps long-term residents have a kind of roughly equal stake. And maybe, perhaps that's the relationship that grounds these special obligations. And what I want to say about this kind of argument is that if equal stakes, if the fact that this group of individuals have roughly equal stakes in a political society is itself a function of their status as citizens or long-term residents of the political society, then you can't cite the fact of equal stakes in order to justify who should be permitted to share citizenship or residence and so have equal stakes. In other words, it's a bit like, so the problem here is a bit like saying that only property holders, pre-existing property holders, should be the ones who have a right to determine what the property rules of a property regime are, as of course was historically said, right? I mean, that was in the history of democratic country representative government. That's how it was. Suffrage was restricted by property rights, but the problem there is that what we're asking for is a justification for who it is that will be permitted to have equal stakes in the political society, not a description of who has equal stakes in the society. So there's a kind of a problem of taking a description of who has equal stakes for the justification for who should have it. So what we're looking for is a justification. So those are different kinds of social relationships that are sometimes identified, and these are some of the problems that in the paper I argue they have. There's a few others, but I'll skip over these and move to the civic relationship of citizenship itself as the ground for special obligations. In particular, joint participation in the common political life of a political society. So you get one variant of this kind of an argument in Nagel's well-known article about global justice, where he argues that there are these special obligations amongst and towards those who are the putative, what he calls joint authors of the coercively imposed system of laws, in whose name the institutions act through the active engagement of their will. So this idea of acting in their name, the active engagement of the will of those whose lives it regulates, who are therefore understood to be the joint authors of the laws. Perhaps these joint authors then enjoy they have special obligations towards each other that could ground the special obligations challenge to more open borders. And what I want to do is distinguish between two different interpretations of this Nagelian argument. One is an active interpretation. This isn't Nagel's own argument. This is an argument that Stephen Macedo makes, for example, about borders. The idea here is the notion of joint authorship is understood in a democratic or an active way. You are joint authors of the laws insofar as the state allows and therefore presumes your actual participation in the political processes that determine the laws that regulate our common affairs. And what I want to say here is that, well, if this is the ground for special obligations that allows you then if this political relationship is what is supposed to be the ground for these special obligations that are owed to precisely those joint authors, there's a kind of a perverse result. And the perverse result is that it implies that a state could avoid special obligations to individuals just simply by refusing to allow them to participate in political processes. In other words, it sort of adds insult to injury. It says that we don't have to provide you with any social rights, for example, because we've already denied you political rights. And this is, of course, the problem. I mean, what's a historical example of this? Colonialism, let's say, right? So you have a colonial power, and somebody says, well, look, you really should be. You have these special obligations to those over whom you're exercising political power. And the colonial power says, no, we only owe these special obligations to those people who we've already allowed to engage politically. And so you might think, well, this is just adding insult to injury, right? It says, well, we've done one wrong and that's justifying a second wrong. So there's a kind of a perversity, I think, to this problem. Nagel himself addresses the case of colonialism, and this is in part why he adopts not an active interpretation. So he's not vulnerable to this objection that I've just leveled. He adopts a passive interpretation of what joint authorship means. So joint authorship for him means that the state simply claims authorization from its subjects by relying on their sort of quasi-voluntary compliance with the laws. Okay, so in the case of colonialism, he argues, the colonial subjects are authors in his sense of the laws, insofar as they are expected to comply by the state itself. They claim a right to rule, and therefore an obligation on the part of the colonial subjects to obey the laws. But he says, notice that this is not the case, he argues, with migrants. He says that states do not claim to impose duties on migrants, they just enforce their laws against them. Okay, so there's no claim of a right to rule, there's no claim of authority understood in this robust sense, and so that political relationship is lacking, and so there's no special obligations to outsiders, but there is to insiders, even in the case where they're deprived of active political rights of participation. And so this kind of bypasses the objection of perversity that one might level against the colonial case. Or not even the colonial case, by citing the colonial example as paradigmatic of what's perverse about the active interpretation. And And so the argument here is that in virtue of not making any claims over migrants, we don't owe them special obligations. We owe the special obligations to our domestic poor, and so those special obligations are what grounds the right that we have to close our borders to the outsiders. And what I want to say is that argument also is perverse in a sort of parallel way to the active interpretation. It's perverse because, well then, in this case, a state could avoid having special obligations to individuals simply by treating them as legal non-persons. The way that you treat a slave. So slavery, if colonialism is a good example of the problem and perversity of the active interpretation, slavery is a good example of the problem with Nagel's own passive interpretation. In other words, right, the problem is that just by exercising sheer coercion over individuals, you get yourself off the hook from having any special obligations as well, right? And that's I take it a straightforwardly rather perverse result. So let me give you a diagnosis of what's going on here, why you get this kind of perversity in the Nagelian argument. There's a fundamental mistake, I think, in his account. And it's true, so there's a kernel of truth in the account, which is that the joint exercise of political power does give rise to special obligations. So I think that's right about Nagel's view. The fundamental mistake is that those special obligations are owed to the subjects of the exercise of political power, not to the authors of political power. So in other words, right, yes, the joint exercise of political power gives rise to special obligations, but it's not owed to those who are exercising the political power. It's owed to those over whom the power is being exercised. So I take it that, in a kind of straightforward way, Nagel's argument falls afoul of the Spider-Man principle, right? With great power. Okay. So, good. So I take it that the civic sort of argument that looks to citizenship as the ground for special obligations to block the justice argument for more open borders also fails for these reasons. But what about turning to a directly political relationship? The joint responsibility, precisely what I was just talking about, of exercising power. You might think that there's a kind of a requirement of justice to exercise power responsibly in some way, and that doing so then, in order to be able to exercise power responsibly, it gives rise to special obligations to those over whom you are exercising political power. Richard Miller, for example, has argued this, and I think that by and large this is right. So when he argues, in particular, Richard Miller does, that when you exercise political power over a set of subjects, that you must do so in a way that respects three different principles or norms. First of all, you must do so in a way that gives each subject of the exercise of political power a reason to support the legal norms that you are imposing on them willingly. Okay, so one of the things that you want to do in order to be able to say that, yes, power is being exercised in a responsible way, you might even cash this out as a kind of requirement of justice, that you have to do so in a way that gives each person, each subject, a reason to support the legal norms willingly. And then you add to that, as Miller does, that this requires showing special concern for the needs of the compatriots who are the subjects of the power of the state, who are particularly disadvantaged. Right? So you have to show special concern to those over whom you're exercising political power in order to give them a reason to comply and support the legal norms willingly. And the way that you do this in the case of disadvantaged subjects is by showing them special concern, giving special concern to their welfare. Okay? And so then you can see, right, so that might start giving you some ground for the special obligations challenge for why it is that we have to be especially concerned with the domestic poor. Second point that Miller makes is that we have to compensate for a fact about the way that political power, when it is exercised, it structures a system of social advantages and disadvantages, and it inevitably creates some social disadvantages for some people who are subject to the regime. And so you have to compensate for that. So those that are disadvantaged precisely because of the way that opportunities and so on have been structured by the exercise of political power should be compensated. And so that gives you, again, a special obligation to the domestic poor, if you like. And third, that those who richly prosper from the joint provision of social opportunities, thanks to these political institutions, owe a special concern to compatriots who don't prosper. Now, one thing that I want to make note of is that in the first two cases, what we have is a kind of special obligation that is owed by the, if you like, those who exercise political power, or the authors of the exercise of political power, that is owed by them to the domestic poor. In the third instance, it's about those who benefit. So it's not necessarily those who exercise power, but those who benefit from the exercise of political power owe special obligations to those compatriots who do not prosper as much as they did from the, say, scheme of mutual cooperation that was provided by the political institutions. And so the question is, okay, does that get you an argument to restrict borders in order to protect the domestic poor? Well, the first thing that we have to do to evaluate this argument is to notice that interstate borders themselves, on the first principle about how you have to exercise power responsibly, insofar as interstate borders are enforced through the exercise of political power, and it's one of the most significant ways in which states are exercising political power in the contemporary world is by regulating migration, that interstate borders must give migrants reasons to willingly comply with regimes of border control. So that is related to the first principle. And second, that we should notice that the interstate regime of border control is one of the ways that states create social disadvantages and advantages. In fact, they create social disadvantages for outsiders. In fact, one of the sort of functionally, if you look at one of the purposes, both historically, about why regimes of border control have arisen is economic. It's in order to protect economic interests and to protect economic interests of insiders in relation to outsiders. So it is, in a way, both in its genesis, in its function, and in its effect, a regime that creates social disadvantages for some and advantages for others, and normally it creates social disadvantages for outsiders. Right, so then, so what's the upshot then? It seems as if you can't get an argument from this political relationship that exists amongst compatriots towards the kinds of special obligations that would trump or that would outweigh the general obligations that one has to outsiders in the way that you exercise political power over them to enforce borders, to enforce regimes of border control. Now, one of the things that I just kind of want to end, I think, this argument so far, I want to end by saying that one of the things that I've assumed in the presentation so far, which you might want to challenge, is that I've assumed that where there is a genuine conflict between special obligations that add to our responsibilities, to our near and dear, when there's a conflict between those special obligations and general duties that we have to others, that the general duties have to be satisfied before we can then go on to satisfy our special obligations that are additive in that way. And you might say, well, and I've argued that the special obligations that we get from these various relationships when they work, say in the case of reciprocity, that they give additive special obligations. They don't allow you to prioritize in a way that gets you off the hook from your general duties towards others. So I've assumed that you can't fulfill these special responsibilities by shirking your general duties. And someone might argue, well, but surely sometimes under conditions of scarcity, we can't fulfill both our special obligations and our general duties. The resources that we have for discharging them are limited, and it's not feasible to do both. And that surely sometimes is the case that our special responsibilities must outweigh our general duties that we have under these conditions of scarcity. And I want to grant that yes, there are circumstances in which your special responsibilities may outweigh general duties that you have. And so then the question is, okay, well, what are the circumstances under which that might happen? And I want to argue that those circumstances, I don't have a general theory about when that happens, but I want to give you a few considerations that speak against the application of that argument to the case of borders. So here are some thoughts about potential candidates for when special responsibilities to the near and dear might outweigh our general duties to persons as such that you are, by justice, required to treat as equals. These are when special obligations are grounded in deep and very robust special relationships that everyone has a reason to value non-instrumentally. So think here of intimate relationships. They're deep in the sense that they're intimate. They are robust in the sense that everybody has a reason to value them non-instrumentally. Friendship or family relationships, I think, fall under this category. So when you have special obligations like that, as opposed to general duties that are positive general duties. So they require you to actually do something rather than refrain from doing something. I think in that case you have pretty good candidates for the possibility of the special obligation outweighing the general duties in the case of a conflict between them. And what I want to notice is that the special obligations challenge to more open borders meets neither of these requirements. Compatriotic relationships are neither deep in the sense of being intimate. We generally do not have face-to-face intimate relationships with all of our fellow citizens, thank goodness. And nor are they particularly robust in the sense that not everybody has a good reason to value them. In fact, as a matter of empirical fact, not everybody does value relationships of citizenship in a non-instrumental way, right? So in fact, many people who are citizens value their citizenship in an instrumental way. This is probably true of a large proportion of the population of our own country, and certainly a large proportion of the province that I reside in. So, and it's important to see that the general duties in question that we are now supposed to be overcoming are negative ones, as I've characterized them. They're not positive general duties. So it's not the case that I've supposed that justice requires that we treat, that justice requires that in treating others as equals, we have to do certain things for them, but rather that we have to refrain from exercising coercive political power over them in particular ways, right? You can't deprive them from the opportunities to meet their basic needs, nor to entrench the structural sources of material inequality. So to conclude then, I don't think that the special obligations that might arise, for example, because of relationships of reciprocity through a mutually beneficial scheme of social cooperation, could outweigh these general duties that we have to outsiders. And so the special obligations challenge to more open borders, I think, fails. Let me put this as a slogan. You can't associate yourself out of the general duties that you have to others. I'll stop with that.
Okay, so we'll now just open up for some questions. You'll notice there are microphones. Now these, I should say, these aren't meant to amplify the sound, but they're just for the recording. So for questions, make sure you've got a microphone in front of you just so we can record your question.
Let me also just put in a plug that it's by coincidence, as I was getting ready to come yesterday, I got news that the article on which this is based in is coming out in this edited volume by Sarah Fine and Leah Ippy. It's called Migration and Political Theory. And apparently it has just come out as of, I don't know, a couple of days ago or yesterday. Yeah. Oh, well, I don't think they're in bookstores yet. I have not seen a copy, but apparently they told me that they've sent it to me. There's some interesting contributions from a range of authors writing on normative questions on borders and migration. So that's a little plug for the book.
Thanks very much. So this is a topic that interests me sort of in a citizen kind of way. I've not really thought hard about it. So I will start with a non-philosophical observation, which is that it's a notable fact that it's true that their relations to their compatriots are not strong or deep, but they do exist. And I mean, in a way, it's bizarre when you think about it that people are happy when a bunch of people who happen to be born in the same country as theirs, they've never met them, and won some game in some tournament that takes place thousands of miles away, and they walk happy on that day. And you say, why would you be happy about this? It has nothing to do with your life, right? And yet, you know what happens here when Canada beats the U.S. in the final in the Winter Olympics in hockey, right? So that's an interesting observation. It's also the case there's the local patriotism of cities. There's the fact that, if I were to meet someone who was born in the same country as me, even though I only spent the first 2 years of my life in that country, I would feel some sort of, or there would be some sense of camaraderie. It wouldn't be deep, but now all that suggests that there is something in human psychology about this sort of group membership that is exploited, if you want, by political entities that maybe kind of cynically exploited, but it's there. And to me that's an observation that's worth thinking about. The second point is also perhaps not philosophically deep, but it's the following. So the first question about the first one is sort of, what do you make of that? And is this of any relevance to a discussion like this? Is it simply an irrational aspect of our psychology that should play no role whatsoever in political philosophy, or maybe it is a significant one. The second one is the following. So here's a way of putting this. Liberals like the welfare state, but hate nationalism. And it's something that makes, and I often wonder whether they don't realize that the former is to some extent related to the latter. Because you can sell the welfare state and, for example, the high taxes that come with it by generating a certain sense of, we owe this to other people, to our compatriots. So the two go together, and it will be very difficult for us to sell, if you want, the welfare state without it. And so the project, therefore, if to succeed in that, must be able to create a sense of camaraderie with the whole world, and then that's a question whether it's possible. Now here it comes. Here's these observations become perhaps a question. So perhaps there is no argument for special obligations in the context of the state in general, but maybe an argument could be made in the context of the modern welfare state. And it might, the arguments that you discussed in the ad, Richard Miller, it sort of seemed to me to go in that direction, that while you cannot make an argument for special obligations merely by the fact that two people find themselves in the same state, the fact of the welfare state and what it entails creates certain obligations, both on the side of duties and on sides of benefits, that may justify some kind of distinction.
Good. So maybe I'll take them backwards. So first of all, I do think that there are special obligations amongst compatriots. I wasn't trying to deny that there are. I'm trying to deny that the kinds of special obligations that exist succeed in getting you a justification for closing borders, right? By overcoming this general duty that we have about how we exercise political power over people. So I do think there are special obligations, and exactly of the kind that you say, in virtue of, for example, that we are engaged in a scheme of mutual cooperation and so on. Yes, we have special obligations to each other, and that's part of the normative justification for some of the welfare schemes that we have and so on. So, so I don't want to deny that. What I want to say is that insofar as there are these special obligations that we do have to take care of the domestic poor, it can't be done by shirking our responsibilities in how we treat outsiders. It has to be done, perhaps, for example, by having a greater redistribution internally, for example, or by adopting policies that that mitigate some of the structural sources of inequality domestically. Or, you know what, I mean, there's a whole set of options that are available domestically, I think, that we have not exhausted. Maybe at a certain point, you know, you get to a point where there's a genuine conflict, there's no other sort of options available domestically, and but I think that we're very, very far from that point. That's why I've said, you know, more open. I'm not sure how open, you know, how open it will be, but certainly a lot more open than those that we see now, I think, would be justified by the appeal to the justice requirements that I'm pointing to. Now, you might come and say, well, yes, but, and this kind of go backwards to your question, yes, but part of what enables, domestically speaking, given political realities, the development of redistributive policies in a political community is a shared sense of identification among citizens, and that this is a very important psychological fact that has to be drawn on in order to mobilize support for redistribution policies. This is an empirical debate in the social sciences. I'm more sympathetic to sort of the reverse view about this, empirically speaking, but I mean, this is...
I'm just adding, what's the reverse?
Right, it's that it puts the cart before the horse. So actually, I think there's a lot of evidence that shows that actually sentiments of social solidarity arise thanks to political institutions that show concern in this way. I mean, think about the current, I mean, Alberta is an interesting situation right now. I guess we'll see, where there's a kind of a psychological disconnect in Alberta right now, where all of a sudden they feel like, oh my gosh, are we turning into, do we need to ask for handouts? This is all over the Alberta newspapers right now. It's like, are we asking for handouts? Is this what the Trudeau trip is all about? And so what's interesting about it is that you get this rhetoric of national solidarity that supposedly is supposed to be the grounds for thinking about redistribution in, say, equalization payments. But in fact, what's interesting about what's going on right now, it shows the way in which the existence of these institutions is in a way productive of these kinds of sentiments of solidarity. Oh, right, yeah, right. We can count on, these institutions, and boy, do I feel good about these institutions. I mean, there's a kind of a reverse causal process there. But that's an empirical debate. Let me address the normative issue about identification more directly. And so you say, yes, isn't there a phenomenon here about, we cheer for we feel great about the success of our team, the team of our country, and so on. Isn't that an important psychological fact? Is it irrational, and so on? No, I don't want to make any argument about it being irrational. And a sense of identification may very well ground special obligations. That might be the case. But what I want to say is that special identification with fellow citizens does not get you off the hook from your general duties to those with whom you don't identify. So this is true even in the case of the intimate sphere, where I think the notion of special obligations is clearest, right? So think about the special obligations that I have as a father to my daughter, for example, right? If it turned out that, I was the kind of father who could really care less about my kids, and so if, I was making a decision about, will I take this decision that will have an impact on these kids? And one of them happened to be my kids, and the other kids, I don't really care that much about my own kids. Maybe I'm going to favor these other kids because I like them more. This, I think, would be a kind of diagnosis of what is wrong with me, not a justification for me then favoring these other kids, right? So the normative, I think the point is that this kind of identification, when it comes to these special obligations, it gives you kind of empirical, one of the roles that it has to play is perhaps grounding special obligations. That's a normative role, but not the kind of special obligation that gets you off the hook from treating others. And also that there are obligations that we have, let me put it this way. Our lack of identification with outsiders is not an excuse for not living up to our general obligations towards them. So I gave you a slightly different example because I was giving you an example of lack of identification with those to whom you have a special obligation. It's the relationship of parenthood that grounds the special obligation, not my sense of identification. If I'm missing it, that's pathological. And in the same case towards other persons, if I'm missing the relevant obligation, it's not the relevant identification. It's not the identification that grounds it. That might motivate it. But what grounds it is the relationship of personhood that we have to others and the requirement of treating them as equals, as equal persons. Yeah.
So I think maybe our difference is perhaps even non-existent because I accepted pretty much everything that you just said. Where I try to kind of say why the welfare state makes a difference is because and that may not exactly be true as well because there are distinctions between what you get when you just enter the country whereas what you get as a citizen. But the thought might be that because entering into a country entails often, or in the welfare state, more benefits, then they're more, then letting someone in goes well beyond the obligations that we have outside of special obligations, and that's something that and so if you want, so if we always have the obligation to go and run and save the baby who's drowning in the pool in the Peter Singer example, if I try to kind of continue with this analogy, then in the welfare state, it's not just saving the boy, it's also then afterwards paying him all the way up to university. Not perfect analogy, but that's the thought. Now, one response that you may have to me is, which you kind of did say, is we have a lot more to go before we end up. And that's, in a way, also an empirical question. And I tend to think that you're actually right. But then the difference is that your argument can, in a way, be made by the sense of by letting people in, we are doing something like saving the drowning baby. And would you agree to that?
There's something to that argument. So that's focusing on the first, right? So remember, there's these two parts to the justice argument, right? There's the poverty and then there's the inequality argument. So that's focusing on the poverty argument. And there's something to putting it that way. I think that part of the issue that I think your point highlights is that we are talking about a general global context in which migration is one way in which somebody's opportunities of escaping poverty might be alleviated. Perhaps there's other empirical ways that could be done, but aren't, right? So maybe one way is that you'd have massive transfers of wealth, right? So that's not happening globally. But the fact that that's not happening doesn't then mean that, okay, well, we can do this other thing too, right? So what we have is that we have a global situation in which there are general duties that we have to people in virtue of being persons, treating them as equals. Maybe those include positive duties. Okay, so there may be positive duties of aid that is required to redress dire poverty in various parts of the world. That might be true. But my point is that The fact that, let's assume that it's true for the moment, that we have these general positive duties to help others, the drowning people of somewhere else. Okay? And let's say that we're not fulfilling these duties. That doesn't then give us a reason to now violate a negative constraint as well, to prevent them from coming to places where, so, oh, they got themselves out of the pool, they need to find some, they just need to walk, they've kind of gotten out, they're on the bank and now they need to walk on the ground and, right? So now we're not going to let them walk on the ground, right? It's not that we're saving them, we're pushing them back in, right? So we can't do that. In virtue of not having saved them, we can't sort of, keep them from, right? So that's the point. Now let's assume that there aren't these general positive duties that require us to save the babies. I guess what I want to say that even if we didn't have a duty to go and save them, we do have a negative duty not to stop them when they're crawling out, is another way to put it.
Thank you.
Yeah.
If I've understood you, you've given a general account of how you say states ought to behave. But I'm just thinking here, I don't travel much. I don't know of any states that currently do behave that way. I wonder if you could list a few and give some more detail about how it's been working out for them?
No, I don't think any states have been acting in this way. That's right. Yeah, that's an empirical observation. Yes, but that's the point of normative principles, is to not describe what people are doing, but to hold them to standards and to criticize and to point to ways in which you can reform political institutions in order to live up to normative principles. There is something to be said for description, which is to describe the norms that states, the norms that are implicit to the political institutions that states themselves claim to abide by. So I think by and large, the two premises that I cited in the first place are normative principles that you could attribute to these states and just say you're not living up to them. So many people think of liberal democratic states as states that are committed to the treatment of all persons as equals in some sense. And so that's why the special obligations challenge is so important, is because it allows, if it succeeds, it allows you to say, yeah, we're living up to these principles that we uphold as liberal democratic states, and that justify the regimes of border control that we actually have. Can I just say one other? You're asking an empirical question, so how, I guess, if I reform, yeah.
Basically, I just have a statistical view of what normativity is.
Oh, right. Yeah. Well, that's a different sense of normativity. Yeah. So in one sense of normativity is descriptive, which is these are the rules that a social scientist can observe that people are following in their social interactions. That's from a third-person perspective describing social reality. I'm using the term normative here from a first-person perspective of what are the rules that you and I can justify to each other if we're having an argument internally. So from an internal perspective, not an external third-person observant perspective. But I mean, there is an empirical question that it might be implicit to sort of what you're asking, which is what would be the empirical consequences if states, lived up to these kinds of norms? And so there's various arguments. Some people might say, well, this would lead to the collapse of the economy, or it would lead, if you had more open borders, it would lead to the collapse of the welfare state, and so on. And so those are empirical arguments that, by and large, I reject, though that's not the topic of the paper. I think the fears of collapse are largely exaggerated.
Stephanie.
Thanks for that. So I haven't thought much about these issues, though they seem really important. So one thing I wanted to do was get clearer on your thesis. So one argument would be that special obligations do not justify the border controls that we have anywhere like what we've got now. Another one would be that special obligations wouldn't justify very significant border controls, even though they're far more permissive than the ones that we have now. Which of those Or maybe a more pointed way to put it, would your argument be that there's no special obligation that would justify border controls of any sort?
I wouldn't
You wouldn't go
make
that
the
far?
argument that far. I think that it's conceivable that there are special obligations that would justify some level of border controls. But I think the argument, so to justify all things considered. And so, but the all things considered, I think, will have to take into account a whole set of other empirical questions about what the effects of various levels of border control would be on, say, the domestic economy, the capacity for the welfare state internally, its capacity of, the capacity of absorption and integration and so on. And all sorts of empirical questions have to be on the table if what we're looking for is an all things considered view. So special obligations could play some role. The problem is that it's not, I can't right now say what role I think it would play once we get to the point where it could play a role, which is far from where we are now, because the empirical questions are, in a way, it's difficult to prejudge those questions since we're so far away from those circumstances. So it seems to me that all that we need right now is to make an argument that special obligations do not justify the levels of border control that we have now, and that the argument as it stands justifies much more open borders. I don't know how it will play out, all things considered, once we get to greater levels of openness. Yeah.
Thank you.
I'm taking my apologies, I should explain this. I'm taking a cue. So if you've got a question, just signal it on, and I'll mark you down on the queue. So we've got Jorge, then Will, and then here.
Thank you for the talk. I wanted to push a little bit forward the argument on scarcity. And just, I know the empirical claims here might not suffice, but let's go with the case of IT. Is that the pronunciation? IT? Okay, sorry. With IT, I have nothing against immigrants, as you might tell. In this case, you had a lot of people from this country, after the devastation of the earthquake and natural disasters, going to countries such as South America, where you don't usually reject people. But in this case, they were rejected. The same thing happened with many African immigrants that were coming to South America. And the argument that was given is, we barely have enough for our own people. So I can understand this argument working in the first world. But how can you make a claim of this sort of, special obligations do not prevent you from respecting your general obligations in this scenario where you actually have a case where you don't have enough resources to fulfill the special ones? So that will be my concern. I agree. Many of the things I've heard in the talk is like, yes, I think that open borders should be the case, the rule, but I can understand this argument in this other context. Yes. Okay, thank you.
I haven't thought enough about the cases of non-wealthy countries that are relatively better off than even poorer countries. And so I'm not really sure how the argument would play out in those cases. And that's partly why I've restricted it to, and part of the reason is, especially for the second aspect of the argument, which has to do with inequality, I think the context of inequality has to be global. So there's a kind of, so in a way, I could see the special obligations argument in the case of these more mid-range countries that you're describing, doing work against the second leg of the justice argument, the inequality argument, right? Because you might argue that these states' regimes of border control are not entrenching the structural conditions of material inequality in the global context. It's rather the wealthier countries that are doing that through their regimes of border control. So that in a way, I think, the special obligations argument, I think, can work against the second leg. Whether it works against the first leg of the argument, the poverty argument, or the sort of very basic needs argument, I'm a little bit skeptical about, but I don't have a sort of considered view about it. I'm skeptical about it because, again, I take it that what you're describing is societies that, by assumption, let's say that you're describing a society that does have the internal capacity to meet the very basic needs of its own population, and that it can do more, let's say. In that case, and that the potential migrants, their very basic needs are at stake. In that case, then I think that maybe the special obligations argument will not go through. So, but I sort of put a question mark on it.
Well, in some way, my question's already been asked by Jorge. It's the thing about getting at the end of the queue, you get preempted. I was going to suggest that your argument, as you presented it, presupposes that the general obligation is a negative one. So, you can't prevent people, but I was just going to make the suggestion that by fulfilling that obligation, then you bring people into the country, and then automatically you've got a whole raft full of positive duties. So I'm not sure you can actually separate the positive and the negative ones in the same way, because you are, by fulfilling the negative duty, automatically committing yourself to a whole range of different positive duties. And if the situation is as Jorge describes, then you've got difficulty.
Right, it's true that, I think there's a problem with the word automatic. So it's not it's causally downstream. So there's a kind of a causal process that intervenes in between these two moments. So there's the moment of, do you let somebody in? And then there's a set of physical facts that have to intervene between them being permitted juridically to enter and physically to enter, and then acquiring these new, say, social rights in virtue of being present, and various kinds of civil rights, right? Like, now the police will have to protect them from murder. That's another thing that happens, right? You enter all kinds of other things. So the automaticness, what I want to say about the automaticness is that it is not constitutive of the act of not coercing people, that's what happens. Right? It's true that the way that we've set the state up is such that if they enter into the state, now the state has an obligation, even as a visitor, right? If a tourist enters into a country, the state has an obligation to protect them from random killings and so on, right? So there's a whole set of, and the police has to be deployed, and there's resources to make that happen. I guess what I'm trying to say is that I think to fully work out the argument to that kind of a challenge, I would have to give you a much more nuanced account of what entry means, right? So there's sort of physical entry, and then there's the status of resident, that it gives you these other rights, and so on. And so then I think there's some, there's some complications that occur in the argument there. It's because in virtue of physically having entered the country, now what kinds of obligations does the state have? Does it have an obligation to let you stay, give you residency, why, and so on. So, but yeah, I think Michael Blake has made an argument that is along the lines that I think you're pressing against. That he suggests that the problem is that precisely in virtue of entering into a political community, that a migrant now imposes new obligations on compatriots. And so those compatriots have a kind of a right to deny them the opportunity to impose those obligations on them. And I think that's a mistaken view about how to characterize it, because what I'm talking about is general obligations that already obtain. And so it's not in virtue of entering into the state that we have an obligation, for example, to ensure that people, so this is invoking the positive obligations in a way. Once we're talking about welfare state issues, then we have to think about, okay, what kind of general duties do we have to foreigners? And I think that they do include the saving the baby sort of story that you were putting in. But that might weaken the rhetorical force of the argument, because all I'm doing here is appealing to this negative constraint. And I think that's what I guess you're saying, isn't there behind these negative constraints? Isn't there sort of positive duties that have to be doing some work as well?
Yeah.
Yeah. I have to think about that more. I think that's a good point.
So I'm curious about your thoughts about the evolving situation in Europe, the large migration and the speed that it's happening, and the impact that it's having on, well, at least allegedly having on the existing social order in some of these countries. You know, I'm thinking about Germany and the situation in Cologne. How does that situation sort of factor into your analysis about special duties versus general duties?
So the state doesn't just have special obligations to its, the special obligations challenge focuses on the special concern that we need to show for the domestic poor, right? But the state also has obligations to those who are on its territory, say public order obligations, to maintain public order within its own territory. And so there's a kind of a public order argument that you can make that would justify restrictions, border restrictions, if it's the case that a certain regime of border control would lead to public disorder and the incapacity of the state to maintain, basic, civil rights of individuals, for example. That would be an argument for restricting borders. But these turn on various kinds of empirical complications. So there may be domestic actors that as a result of, so put it this way, it might be the case that one of the intervening causes and necessary intervening causes for why there's disorder in a state is that you have various xenophobic groups who don't like migrants, and so they start attacking them, right? So now you have a public order problem. All right, so the question is whether the normative requirements that the state is under and those citizens are conditional on the violation of moral principles that people should not be violating. So in a way, can racists hold the state hostage is another way to put this question, right? So there's a kind of a, do the normative principles that count for evaluating what the state should do depend on, are they sort of comprehensive, as Jerry Cohen might have put it, right? Are they sort of comprehensive? Do you have to take into account, do you have to give a kind of comprehensive theory, or should it be conditional on on taking for granted certain violations that will occur, right? And so there's a...
So I'm thinking more fundamentally,
Yeah.
From public order, like the size or the speed of the migration could impact the values, right, and the social order.
Yes.
And to begin to reorganize that.
Yes.
And is that something that is of interest to the, to the
Yes.
citizens of that country, and how should we account for that?
Yes, so insofar as just sheer numbers and perhaps cultural difference and integration, right? Integration problems of integrating people into a new society, insofar as those are the primary reasons why there's a public order problem, then as I said, I think that gives you a straightforward justification for restricting borders. Empirically, whether that's the case or not is a different question, because I think there's these other factors at play in the European cases that you're citing. So there's a public order issue. I think you're also kind of pointing to not just public order, but perhaps a change in the culture of the host society that will inevitably be affected in virtue of large amounts of migration, a change in norms and so on, and that sort of thing. And I guess what I would say to that is there are a few considerations. One is that it depends on It depends on whether there is an operative principle of cultural preservation or not. And that gets into a very complicated argument about what are the conditions under which a people has a right to defend its culture in the face of potential submersion by outsiders. And what I want to, so that's a feasible argument. And I mean, generally what we can think of is, very small populations that would be submerged by large populations. So if this is the but empirically in human history, this has basically only occurred under colonial conditions, where a culture has been wiped out, where you have, because of migration, a culture has been submerged in this way, has occurred under colonial conditions. It has not occurred under conditions of open borders that were not colonial. That's historically how it's happened.
This might be slightly unfair because you only mentioned at the very beginning. You wanted us to take for granted this argument that an influx of refugees would harm the poorest in a nation. And you say that's kind of empirically dubious, and I think you're right. I don't think I've ever been convinced by that argument. And then you said something like, actually, if you look at it, the people harmed by an influx of refugees were the past refugees. Did you say something like that?
So what the empirical evidence that I'm looking at, what it shows, it's not necessarily refugees, it's just low-skilled workers, low-skilled migrant workers. What happens through this one mechanism that I'm talking about, which is through depression of wages at the low end of the pay scale. What happens is that, so I mean, you can think, theoretically, the mechanism that's supposed to be in play is fairly straightforward. So let's say that you have a certain number of jobs that are available in the labor market at the low end of the pay scale, and you have a certain fixed number of workers. And then what happens is you add a whole bunch of other workers to that labor market. Well, then the price would go down on sort of neoclassical economic theory, right? So so that's the mechanism that's supposed to wage competition is supposed to depress wages at the low end. And so empirically, what's interesting, what happens is that actually migrant workers who are low-skilled workers do not compete for the same jobs as native-born workers who are low-skilled because the skills that they have, even though they're low-skilled workers, are different than the skills that native-born workers have. So a lot of these have to do with communication, for example. They don't have the language skills, for example. They don't have the same social network, whatever, right? So they're not substitutable for each other, but they are substitutable for prior migrants.
Right.
And so they have the same kinds of skills as prior migrants. So what you get is you have, let's say, citizens who themselves were immigrants, right, who are low-skilled. They will tend to be competing for the same jobs as ongoing migrants who are low-skilled. And so what you do, and empirically what you do see is you see evidence of wages going down for them. So then there's a kind of a question, okay, well, what about these citizens who are being harmed?
Right,
There's
yeah, and that I was going to say, does the state, by then taking in, let's just say Ontario commits itself to taking in 15,000 Syrian
Yeah.
refugees, and we get them in and we successfully integrate them and they start working and stuff. At what point does Ontario have to say, we can't really take any more because we don't want to further harm the 15,000 we've already taken in?
Right.
So that's...
So what I mean, so that's a different argument than this one, and what
I know it is. That's why I said...
Right. So what but a lot of the same considerations I think apply here in this case too. So the special obligations that you have to them don't get you off the hook to the general duties that you have to potential migrants. And furthermore, I think that there's a good way of construing those former migrants themselves as having special obligations to potential future migrants obligate them to sort of, even if the state did have kind of an obligation to them to close borders, then they have an obligation to discharge the state from that. I think that's how it would work. And the way that I'd characterize this is as a kind of a reciprocity. It's not a standard form of reciprocity where you benefit those who have previously benefited you, which is kind of how reciprocity normally works, but it's the kind of reciprocity that is invoked sometimes in the literature on intergenerational justice. So, we have a kind of duty of reciprocity to future generations to leave the earth as good as the previous generations left it for us. It's a kind of reciprocity, but it's not towards the same people who benefited us. And so.
Stephanie, follow-up question?
Second bite at the apple. I'm just trying to think of the toughest argument that I could give in response to try to push. So it seems like it'd be important to pull apart a question of, okay, what's the best policy we might have as a polity with respect to immigration? What's the justified policy for us? But then another question would be, well, are we justified as a polity in exercising political power to enforce this particular suboptimal policy that we've implemented? And so someone might want to tell kind of a piggybacked story. You know, first, okay, there are special obligations to ensure a predictable social environment that's a home for this set of people. You know, there are you know, various special obligations. And there's a lot of debate about what they are, what their contours are, and there's empirical debate too. And then on top of that, there's going to be this democratic requirement that everyone should have an equal say. Like, you know, the democratic process within a particular country should deliberate about this particular question. And then the thought would be, okay, there's a question about what the special obligations allow us to do. There's a democratic imperative that, you know, we make this decision, given each an equal say in this community about what we're going to do. And that justifies us in exercising political power to keep these folks out in accordance with this policy, even if it isn't optimally just. It could be quite far off from the optimally just policy.
And we're justified in doing so. Sorry, what's not optimally just? The domestic regime or the regime of border control?
The policy we implemented.
With respect to borders or domestically?
With respect to borders. Like, so we're doing this to protect something that we have a special obligation to protect. We overshoot. We're overprotective. But we made that overprotective decision through a democratic process.
Oh, I see. So it's the democracy that's getting you this extra
This
bit
extra
of...
bit.
Uh-huh.
This extra, and
Right.
it maybe could get you, you know, rather significant extra bit.
Yeah. I don't think that's right. And I don't think that's right because when you were talking about democratic justification, the democratic principle that's relevant is that those over whom you exercise political power have a right of democratic say over how it's exercised over them. You didn't give the foreigners any right of democratic say in the regime of border control. So there's no democratic justification for the regime of border control that you could appeal to. If you had given the foreigners a right of democratic say in the regime of border control that you're imposing on them, I'd grant the point. Yes, I could see closed borders that were democratically justified to those who are subjected to the regime of border control. Yeah.
I see the force of this, but I'm wondering if there might be, you know, a textured. I'm tempted by saying something like, okay, the immigrants have no duty not to flout this law. That's, you know, that's one issue, sure. But that's not the claim. The claim is, no, we were justified in doing this. You have no duty,
Yeah.
but we were justified. And we're justified by dint of our special obligation and also this democratic requirement that everyone, you know, have an equal say. So we're justified. They don't have a duty. The immigrants don't have a duty, but we're justified in exercising political power in this case. What's the alternative? The alternative is not to give the people in this community an equal say and just, you know, override it in the name of, I suppose, the better policy. I'm not sure.
What's the alternative? Is that they decide to have juster borders.
Yeah, but they won't if they do it democratically.
What do you mean?
So the thought is that, you know, what justifies us in executing this very particular policy is that it was democratically decided within this group. Even though it was a mistake, I'd want to admit that if the mistake's bad enough, maybe it wouldn't be justified.
Right, so in virtue of the fact that I'm the one who's decided how to treat you, that kind of gets a kind of justification because I decided this. I decided myself.
Yeah.
I kind of freely, and no one manipulated me in the way that I'm going to treat you now. And so now I'm justified because I kind of voluntarily myself, through the free exercise of my rational capacities, I will to treat you in this way, that is a violation of a condition of justice in our interpersonal relationships. But that's justified. True, you don't have a duty to sort of let me do it, but I can still, I'm in the sense that I have a moral liberty to treat you in this way because I'm the one who decided how to treat you.
So on the guard at the border,
Yeah.
keeping these folks out, what when I think, okay, why am I justified in doing this? Well, this democratic policy decided this is the thing to do.
Yeah.
They made a mistake, but it's still, there's something valuable about maintaining the equal say of this group with respect to that policy. Now, there are limits. If it's
Yeah.
too horrid, then I can't do it.
Are you, yeah.
Can I?
Yeah.
If I'm taking too long,
No, 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 I think I can put it in a different,
Okay,
I think I see where there might be a gap between.
okay.
So, so in the way that you were responding was to say that there was an I who's decided to take
Yeah.
a certain course of action, whereas I think Stefan is suggesting that there's maybe a rupture. There is no single I there. So when we talk about the state, we could either be referring to its institutional offices, executive, Congress, or what have you, as well as talking about what the people have as particular duties. So it could be the case that the people within a particular society have general obligations to outsiders, to foreigners, which aren't compromised by conditions of scarcity or maybe instability that might be caused, and whose general obligations also aren't compromised by special obligations towards each other. So you could have this democratic people, which has these obligations to have more open borders, but the means by which they act, or which through which they act, is through their institutions,
Yeah.
representative
Right.
democratic
Right.
institutions, which then have special obligations to their people. So their people have these obligations, but they choose not to authorize democratically their institutions to act on their behalf and open their borders. Then you've got a kind of,
Good.
a kind of democratic paradox where it's supposed to protect liberty and equality, but because there's this institutional layer, it's actually preventing the institutions which are capable of acting
Right.
from, right? So you'd almost have to say in that case then, there may not be an argument for having public means by which to sort of let, open the borders more pervasively or create more pores, but there's an argument to be made for sort of private acceptance or inclusion of more low-skilled workers or
Okay.
refugees. And there's kind of, Jack
Yeah.
Goldsmith, I think, has an argument along these lines in this paper, I think it's Liberal Democracy and Cosmopolitan Duty, where he says, well, the people might have these certain obligations, but in virtue of the fact that they have a representative democracy as their institutional way of governing, that level or that layer gets in the way
Right.
of the execution or
So
satisfaction. duties.
can I just take your initial point and go in a slightly different direction? Because I think this may kind of get at both of your. So let me try and reconstruct. There's a people that, let's grant my argument, which I think you were granting. Let's grant the argument that they have a duty to keep their borders open. But through these democratic processes, which we'll assume have some kind of legitimacy to them, they decide not to keep their borders open. And so they authorize state officials to, close the borders. And so I take it that when you clarify that there's the people and there's these state officials that have been authorized, their representatives have been authorized by them to take certain actions, which were not the actions that they should have authorized them to, but that they did. But given that there's some kind of legitimacy about this process, there's two different questions. What should the laws be? And what should the guard at the border do? And so I take it that your argument might be that my argument so far is not properly addressed to the border official. The border official may still have the moral liberty to enforce the border at the border. That the border official does no wrong in following the laws.
You might go say that about the state in some sense, the executive apparatus anyway.
What's that?
The executive apparatus.
You might want to say that about them too?
There's just a bunch of border officials carrying out the will of the.
Okay, well, we'll if we want, we can start talking about which institutions we're talking about in the state. But I'm willing, at the limit, I'm willing to grant the point. And so, I guess two things. One is that the argument is addressed to a democratic public rather than to the border official. I think you're right. But that the argument might at some point also be addressed to the border official. So you might think that, right? You might think that the violation of justice is so egregious in these particular cases that the border official actually has a duty to bypass, what they've been authorized by the democratic people in violation of requirements of justice to do as an act of civil disobedience. So maybe let some people in if they can. Well, sort of a Schindler's List style thing, right? Under those circumstances. But, that's not what I'm arguing here. I'm just laying out the logical possibilities as I see it, given I think it's a very good point you're making, yeah. So there's really different actors here. There's the migrants themselves, which you grant are not under any duty. There's the people that is under the duty. And then there's the intermediary actors who are authorized by the people. What are their duties? And
I
so
think a complicating consideration is that you might be willing to grant that at some point there'd be a special obligation to protect the borders, even at the level of policy. And so if the people are arguing about that line, but that's just a further.
Yeah. But I thought the point about the border official is not that they have a special obligation to like the domestic poor, but that they have a kind of positional duty in virtue of their position in the state apparatus, and in virtue of the fact that you're assuming it's a legitimate state and has been authorized through this.
They have a special obligation to reflect the will of the majority of the public.
Right.
And I would say that doesn't just apply to the border official. And then we can just talk about, trying to be clear about who all it applies to.
Did that go away from your point a lot, or was it sort of?
No. I mean, that the way that Stefan just put it there is sort of the objection that I had in mind. I was trying to figure out earlier whether that fit into one of the three arguments for special obligations that you mentioned, and it didn't quite seem to fit neatly into any one of those categories. But I was curious. I mean, a couple of moves that I thought were valuable, and improvements on, say, early Michael Blake work on global justice and Thomas Nagel about what it means to be subject to law. I mean, it's not in the philosophy of law, we're always very careful not to talk about citizens, but rather norm subjects or legal subjects, just because you can be subject to law, not a citizen.
Mm-hmm.
And that includes both within your borders, but also outside your borders. So I've always thought that Michael Blake got it wrong when he thought coercive relationships simply pointed inward. Whereas it seemed like if you try and get into the U.S. illegally and you happen to be faced with a border guard, that's coercion, if anything is, when you're turned away. And so the second move that I thought was valuable was to say, well, if your immigration laws or your laws closing your borders were only democratically authorized by those who are within the political community to begin with, and yet they subject others to those laws because they can't get in, a law which closes borders, which is democratically justifiable, would have to include those who are being excluded as those who've authorized that particular law. That's a valuable, important move, but it's a difficult one to then follow up on or execute. And the parallel which sort of comes to mind is, there's questions about how to democratize institutions such as the Security Council, which are notoriously badly democratically representative. And the complications in trying to think about how that might work, do you go by state, do you go by population, do you go by region, do you have a body of the whole? So I was just curious about whether there was more to that move that you'd considered. How would you properly democratically justify laws which close borders, or close them to some degree rather
Right.
than another? That's a
Yeah.
big question, and one
Yeah.
which has.
So that's not, I mean, that's not part of this paper. This is part of some other stuff that I've done on borders and democracy. And I don't have a kind of an institutional scheme for how it is that you might democratize border regimes. But if one is concerned about democracy and the democratic legitimacy of borders, then it seems to me that the institutional arrangement that we have now is sort of the worst possible arrangement from the perspective of democratic legitimacy, in the sense that there's not even a minimal kind of democratic say that foreigners have over regimes of border control. So you can imagine, interstate arrangements. You can imagine transnational rights. There are various what we lack now is even a lack of a norm of justification to foreigners about our regime of border control. So we have that with respect to war, for example. If a country wants to go to war with others, there's a kind of an international norm where they will, at least these liberal democratic countries will feel obligated to justify themselves in an interstate forum. So when the U.S. attacked Iraq, for example, Colin Powell went to the UN and justified. Now, it's not that they gave a right of democratic say to everybody or to anybody, but the point is that even that is lacking in the case of regimes and border control. So that's pretty far from any. Yeah. But I don't have a theory of what's the best institutional arrangement to embody the norm. What I have is in the context of this argument, that move is designed to show that the supposed democratic authorization of that border official is defective in a very important way. So it's a question about whether that border official, in fact, was democratically authorized and therefore has the relevant justification. So that's what it's designed to show. It's not.
No, I took the argument to show that
Yeah.
that's where the conversation needs
Yeah.
to turn.
Yeah.
John, you had another question.
Yeah, I was just going to give one small example of a very tiny hole in the armor on border controls. That under the Geneva Conventions, even the soldiers in an invading army have minimal rights to be treated as prisoners of war. Even the members of an invading army have minimal rights under international law, as generally understood. I mean, it leads you to the question of what do you think international law is and how are its rules justified?
Mm-hmm.
But that's a real right under international law, is of an invading army.
Any other questions? Okay. Well, thank
All
you
right.
so much.
Well, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.